The year the walls broke, the last king of David's line tried to run. He had watched his city starve for a year and a half. He had watched the Babylonian siege engines grind against the stone he had been born to protect. And when the end finally came, in the summer of what we now reckon as 586 BCE, King Zedekiah slipped out through a gate in the dark, with whatever soldiers he had left, heading east toward the Jordan. He did not get far. Babylonian troops caught him on the plains of Jericho. They brought him to Nebuchadnezzar, and here is the part that stays with you. The very last thing Zedekiah ever saw with his own eyes was the execution of his sons. Then they put out his eyes, bound him in bronze chains, and carried him to Babylon. The royal house of David, the dynasty that had ruled from Jerusalem for roughly 4 centuries, appeared to be finished. But here is what I want you to sit with as we go on this journey together. It was not finished, not even close. The story of what happened to David's bloodline after that catastrophic exile is one of the strangest, most layered, and most consequential threads in all of ancient history. It winds through the palaces of Babylon, resurfaces in the rubble of a rebuilt Jerusalem, disappears into silence for generations, and then reappears in the most unexpected places. By the time we reach the end of it, you will have a very different picture of what it means for a dynasty to die or not die. Let us go back to where the promise began, because you cannot understand the weight of what was lost or what survived without understanding what that promise actually was. David was already old when the prophet Nathan came to him with a message that must have sounded almost too good to be believed. David had wanted to build a great temple for God in Jerusalem. The answer he received was more than he bargained for. Instead of David building a house for God, God would build a house, a dynasty, for David. The language of what scholars call the Davidic covenant, preserved in the 2nd book of Samuel, is striking in its unconditional scope. Your throne, it says, shall be established forever, not for a generation, not as long as you stay faithful, forever. This was not a small promise, and the people who carried this tradition understood it to be the anchor of their entire national identity. Jerusalem was the city of David. The king who sat on its throne was the living embodiment of a divine guarantee. For roughly 400 years, that line held. Generation after generation, a son of David sat on the throne of Judah. There were good kings and terrible ones. There were reformers who tore down the high places and built up the temple, and there were kings who let the whole enterprise drift into idolatry and political chaos. But the line itself never broke. Not through invasion, not through assassination, not through the collapse of the northern kingdom of Israel, which fell to the Assyrians well over a century before Babylon ever turned its eyes south toward Jerusalem. And then came the generation that would watch it all unravel with terrifying speed. The great reformer King Josiah died young, killed at Megiddo in a battle he arguably should not have entered. After him, the kingdom of Judah entered a kind of political and spiritual freefall. In the space of roughly 2 decades, 4 different kings sat on the throne. Egypt pulled strings. Babylon pulled harder. A young king named Jehoiachin, sometimes called Jeconiah, took the throne as a teenager and held it for barely 3 months before Nebuchadnezzar arrived at the gates of Jerusalem in what we calculate as 597 BCE. Faced with overwhelming force, Jehoiachin did something his successor Zedekiah would refuse to do. He surrendered. He walked out of the city voluntarily, along with his mother, his officials, and thousands of the kingdom's skilled craftsmen, soldiers, and elite families. He was taken to Babylon. His uncle Zedekiah was installed as a puppet king in his place. And here is where the story takes its first, unexpected turn. Because Jehoiachin did not disappear into a Babylonian prison and vanish from history. He survived. For decades, he survived. And we know this not merely from the biblical text, we know it from clay. In the ruins of ancient Babylon, archaeologists uncovered a remarkable set of administrative tablets. These are real, physical documents from the ancient Babylonian palace administration, listing rations of oil and grain distributed to various foreign captives and workers. Among the names recorded are Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and his sons. The tablets are matter-of-fact about it, the way any good bureaucratic record is matter-of-fact. This is how much grain your department is getting this month. Please sign here. But the implications are enormous. The heir to David's throne was being kept alive in Babylon, not as a slave laboring in a quarry, but as a royal captive, receiving a royal-level allocation of supplies. He had his sons with him. The bloodline was intact. Those tablets, discovered by German archaeologist Robert Koldewey in excavations conducted between 1899 and 1917, and later studied in depth by Ernst Weidner in the 1930s, list Jehoiachin by name, alongside allocations for 5 of his sons. The rations recorded are not symbolic. They reflect a sustained multi-year commitment on the part of the Babylonian administration to keeping this particular family alive and identifiable. Someone in Nebuchadnezzar's bureaucracy made a deliberate decision that the king of Judah was worth tracking, worth feeding, at a level that distinguished him from common laborers. That decision, made in a palace office in Babylon sometime in the early 6th century BCE, would have consequences that echo for the next 2,500 years. And it gets even more remarkable. The Book of Kings tells us that toward the very end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, a new Babylonian king, Evil-Merodach, or Amel-Marduk, as he is known in Babylonian sources, released Jehoiachin from his imprisonment, elevated him in fact, gave him a seat of honor above all the other captive kings in Babylon, and a regular allowance for the rest of his life. The deposed king of Judah was dining at the table of the king of Babylon. It sounds almost too strange to be true, but the convergence of the biblical account and the Babylonian administrative tablets makes this one of those moments where the ancient record actually holds up remarkably well. Jehoiachin died in Babylon, but he left sons behind, and one of those sons, or perhaps a grandson, the genealogies are debated in their precise details, would become the figure through whom David's dynasty would take its next great step back toward relevance. His name was Zerubbabel. When the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in the mid-6th century BCE and issued his famous decree allowing exiled peoples to return to their homelands, a wave of Jewish exiles began making their way back to Judah. It was not a triumphal march. The land was depopulated, the city was rubble, and the temple was a field of burned stones. But among those who returned was Zerubbabel, a man of unmistakably Davidic blood, who was appointed by the Persians as governor of the province of Yehud, which is what Judah had become under imperial administration. The prophets of that era, particularly Haggai and Zechariah, speak about Zerubbabel in language that crackles with messianic expectation. Zechariah describes him in imagery borrowed directly from the old royal traditions: a chosen one, a signet ring, a branch. There is a palpable sense in those texts that the people who had survived the exile believed Zerubbabel might be the one to restore the full Davidic monarchy, that the promise made to David, the forever promise, was about to be fulfilled. It was not. Zerubbabel oversaw the rebuilding of the temple. He completed it, by most reckonings, around 516 BCE. And then, he disappears from the record. We do not know how he died. We do not know whether the Persians removed him from his governorship, whether he simply grew old and passed quietly from the scene, or whether some political event we cannot now recover ended his public career. The silence is almost louder than anything he did. The man who was supposed to be the restoration of David's throne simply fades out. No coronation, no kingdom, just absence. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange and genuinely contested among scholars, because the Davidic line did not die with Zerubbabel's disappearance. It continued, quietly, in ways that most people have never heard of. Among the Jewish communities that remained in Babylon, and a very large number of Jews chose not to return to Judah when Cyrus permitted it, a tradition developed over the following centuries of recognizing a hereditary leader called the Exilarch, or in Aramaic, the Resh Galuta, which simply means the head of the exile. This was not a casual title. The Exilarchs claimed descent directly from the house of David, from the line of Jehoiachin, and they were taken seriously, not only by the Jewish community in Babylon, but by the Parthian and later the Sassanid Persian rulers who governed that region. For something approaching 1,000 years, there was a recognized Davidic prince sitting in Mesopotamia, administering Jewish communal affairs, receiving formal honors, and maintaining genealogical records that traced their ancestry back to the king who had danced before the ark in Jerusalem. The institutional reality of the Exilarchate is not a legend or a pious hope. It is documented history. By the time of the Sassanid Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the Exilarch held a position of genuine political authority, presiding over Jewish courts, collecting taxes within the Jewish community, and being received by the Persian king in formal ceremonies that acknowledged his dynastic status. The Talmud records debates and rulings involving specific named exilarchs. Later medieval sources, including the 10th century traveller and chronicler Nathan Har-Bavli, describe in vivid detail the court protocol surrounding the Exilarch's public appearances, the silk-robed processions, the designated seating, the formal obeisance paid to him by community members who understood they were in the presence of a man who carried David's blood. One of the most famous exilarchs, Mar-Zutra II, actually led a brief armed revolt against Sassanid Persian rule around 502 CE, establishing what amounted to an independent Jewish principality centered on the city of Mahoza for roughly 7 years before being defeated and executed. That a man claiming Davidic descent could raise an army and hold territory 15 centuries after the fall of Jerusalem is a detail that does not appear in most history books, but probably should. 1,000 years. That is roughly the distance between us and the Norman conquest of England. It is an almost incomprehensible span of institutional memory and lineage preservation. Whatever else you want to say about the fate of David's dynasty, it did not quietly vanish into the dust of Babylon. And then there is the tradition that reaches even further, the one that would eventually reshape the entire Western world. Both the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke provide genealogies for Jesus of Nazareth that trace his descent through the line of David. Matthew traces the line through Joseph, Jesus' legal father, going back through the royal line including Zerubbabel and Jehoiachin, all the way to David and Abraham. Luke provides a different genealogical sequence. Scholars have debated for centuries whether Luke intends to trace Mary's ancestry or provides an alternative version of Joseph's lineage, but both evangelists are making the same essential theological and dynastic claim, that whatever had happened to the house of David since the exile, it had not disappeared. It had continued, generation by generation, in obscurity, until it arrived at a carpenter's family in the Galilee. Now, I want to be honest with you here, because this is a place where careful thinking matters. The genealogies in Matthew and Luke are not identical, and scholars have offered various explanations for the discrepancies. Levirate marriage traditions, different lines of descent, different theological emphases in each author's purpose. These are not questions with easy answers, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What we can say with confidence is that the claim of Davidic descent was clearly important to the early Christian community, was clearly important enough to record in not one, but 2 gospel accounts, and was clearly understood as connecting Jesus to the ancient promise, the forever promise, made to David in Jerusalem centuries before. The thread that ran from Nathan's prophecy to Jehoiachin's ration tablets, to Zerubbabel's silent exit, to the Exilarchs of Babylon, to those 2 genealogies, is one of the most quietly astonishing lines of continuity in the ancient world. And before you think the story ends there, consider this. Some Jewish genealogical traditions maintained over the centuries claim that certain rabbinic families carried Davidic ancestry as well. The great sage Hillel, whose teachings influenced Jewish law profoundly, was by some traditional accounts of Davidic descent. If accurate, that means the DNA of the shepherd king of Bethlehem may have flowed through the veins of the teachers who shaped both Christianity and rabbinical Judaism. Can we prove any of this with modern genetics? Not really. The lineages are too ancient, the documentation too fragmentary, and the claimed descent lines too numerous and too tangled. We are working with genealogical records that were maintained in a pre-modern world where institutional memory and theological purpose both played a role in how those records were kept and transmitted. I am not saying they are false. I am saying they cannot be confirmed by a DNA test, and anyone who claims otherwise is confusing wish with evidence. What we can say is this: the House of David was never simply erased. It was broken, scattered, impoverished, and in many periods entirely invisible to history. But it continued. In the administrative records of a Babylonian palace, in the governorship of a returning exile, in the courts of Parthian and Sassanid kings who recognized a Jewish prince as the legitimate heir of an ancient lineage, in the pages of Gospels read by billions, in traditions of Jewish genealogy that stretch to this day. There is something almost impossibly human about that. Empires rise and conquer and demand submission. They take your king, destroy your temple, and drag your people into exile. And then a scribe in their own palace writes down on a clay tablet that the captive king gets his grain ration, and that grain ration becomes the thread that connects a destroyed throne to a lineage that will outlast the empire that destroyed it. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon is dust. The Persian Empire that replaced it is dust. But people are still arguing about the descendants of David. If you have been enjoying this journey through the ancient world, I would love for you to become part of this community here on Scholar Eli. We go deep on exactly these kinds of stories, the ones that do not fit in a textbook, but absolutely deserve to be told. Hit subscribe and come along for more, because we are nowhere near done exploring. The thing that stays with me, after going deep into all of this, is not the drama of the siege or the horror of Zedekiah's end, though those are certainly unforgettable. What stays with me is the grain tablets. The idea that the survival of one of history's most consequential royal lines comes down, at its most precarious moment, to a Babylonian palace administrator noting in dry bureaucratic language that a certain captive king is to receive his allocation. History pivots on the strangest hinges. Did the promise made to David actually survive? In what sense? Was it the physical bloodline, or the idea of the bloodline, that turned out to matter more? I genuinely do not know. I think it was both, and I think those two things are harder to separate than we usually admit. What do you think? Do you believe a genuine line of Davidic descent made it through the exile and continued into the Common Era? Or does the story of the dynasty belong more to the realm of theological memory than biological fact? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. This is exactly the kind of conversation this community exists for. If this one sparked your curiosity, the story of what happened to the Ark of the Covenant during that same exile is something we really need to dig into together. And the theories are every bit as wild as you would hope. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.